Washington Talk, I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea test-fired short-range missiles, conducting 2 missile tests in just a week. The United States, for the first time, seized a North Korean ship violating international sanctions. When will the U.S. reach the limits of its patience with North Korea?
North Korea was now shooting rockets and missiles.
I don't think they're ready to negotiate. Nobody's happy about it.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Abraham Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Mr. Denmark served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Now, North Korea conducted 2 missile tests in just a week. The second one was a bit provocative than the first one. So what is the message?
I think there's 2 messages. For a domestic audience, I think Kim Jong-un is sending a message that he's still strong, after the failure of Hanoi, that he's still in control, that he's not intimidated by the United States, by outside forces. And I think for the outside world, for international audiences, Kim is sending a message that North Korea is not going to be ignored. That North Korea is not just going to sit on their hands and wait for something to happen with diplomacy, that they're going to keep the pressure on the United States and make sure that that at some point we go back to the negotiating table.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. The North Koreans really cast this as a response to the resumption of a U.S. exercise regime. But also the larger issue is Kim Jong-un trying to define the terms of a possible reinitiation of negotiations with the U.S. By sending a message that North Korea is not going to unconditionally surrender its nuclear capability, and also by trying to influence the question of whose side is time on, and by suggesting to the Trump administration that time might not be on its side, and that it should get a move on in terms of re-engaging with North Korea on the right terms.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Trump administration is showing measured response even after the second testing. So why is this?
I think the administration wants to send a message that we're ready to go back to negotiations with North Korea. But I think that one problem is that the North Koreans haven't yet reached a ceiling in terms of the U.S. response. I think the Trump and Pompeo comments have been too permissive of North Korea continuing to engage in this kind of activity. I think that President Moon came a little bit closer to sending a message about a ceiling by suggesting that these sorts of tests are risking the prospects for continued diplomacy and negotiation.
I think that's about right. In any diplomatic process with North Korea, we've seen them use these sorts of demonstrations as a way to put pressure in the negotiations. And part of the key is to make sure that if you're committed to diplomacy, that you're still willing to talk even as North Korea conducts these actions. And I think this is representative of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was a short-range missile, yet South Korea and Japan, which could be within the range, says, again, this is not a provocation, that this is not a threat, and does not impact their national security. So what do you take of this response from Japan and South Korea?
I think it shows the same attitude, that they want the window for diplomacy to remain open, and they don't want their response to drive a reaction that would close the door on diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was a first testing, and then regional countries showed muted response, and then North Korea went ahead and did second testing. So is North Korea trying to reiterate and reinforce the image that it is indeed escalating tensions, that it is not business as normal?
Well, I do believe that that the North Koreans are reverting to the old style in terms of trying to use the escalation of tensions and the creation of crisis as a way of trying to regain the initiative in the negotiation process. And so I think that what the North Koreans are really trying to do is to drive the U.S. into a mindset where it's more likely that the U.S. will doubt its resolve to achieve complete denuclearization and maybe settle for less than what we were really expecting from the Singapore Declaration.
Mm-hmm. And on the day of the second testing, United States for the first time seized North Korean vessel for violating sanctions. Is this a strong message to North Korea?
I think it's a pretty strong demonstration of American resolve. That in addition to missile tests and other provocations that they're doing on the Korean Peninsula, that the United States is keeping track of what North Korea is doing beyond the Korean Peninsula and will continue to try to enforce these sanctions. So seizing the ship in Indonesia, I thought was a very strong indication of what the United States is willing to do, and that even despite their willingness to go on with negotiations, they're not going to turn a blind eye to all the things that North Korea has been doing.
Right.
If I could add to that, I think that this could be a kind of turning point because just like with the Banco Delta Asia case, when we reached out and touched North Korea directly in terms of stopping money flow, this is a move that reaches out and touches North Korean resources directly. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how North Korea responds to the seizure of the ship.
Does the United States still have very strong leverage on North Korea in the sanctions area?
Sure. The United States still has significant sanctions leverage in terms of its significant role in the international financial system, its strong relationships with most of the major economic actors around the world. But of course, the key question there is China. And with the current events with China, with the failure of trade talks between Washington and Beijing, to me, that further limits Beijing's willingness to work with the United States on a wide variety of issues, including implementing sanctions against North Korea.
Now, regarding the missile, Japan says this is a ballistic missile, but South Korea's National Intelligence Service says they are not still definitive whether this is a ballistic missile because it seems like a new weapon. So why is it so important to discern whether this is a ballistic or not?
Well, the key issue, the reason why it's important is because North Korea, by several UN Security Council resolutions, is prohibited from testing ballistic missiles. And so if this was a ballistic missile test, it would clearly be a violation of those sanctions, of those resolutions. To me, though, the question about whether or not this is a ballistic missile is a bit perplexing, because from what we've seen so far, it's clearly not a cruise missile. To me, it looks like a ballistic missile, but I'm not a technical expert, so I think we still need to see more data before we can make it a definitive claim outside of the government.
And experts say this looks like Russia's Iskander type of missile. What is the intention that North Korea tests this kind of missile?
I think the main focus and use for this potential weapon would be to reach command posts in South Korea and USFK's base there, Camp Humphreys, as a way of suggesting that North Korea can still put valuable assets on the Korean Peninsula at risk.
Now, Mr. Denmark, you were Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Asia. Now, what are the threats the Iskander type of missile pose to Japan and South Korea?
2 points on this. Korea has been under North Korean threat for decades, since the end of the war, really, and Japan for quite a long time as well. So the addition of another short-range ballistic missile, if that's what this is, would represent another layer on an already existing very significant threat to both of those countries. But to me, I look also at the technology that's involved, especially that this missile appears to be mobile, appears to be solid-fueled, which would represent a different kind of missile threat than we've seen before from North Korea, that not only for short-range missiles, but also could have applications for missiles at other ranges.
And Mr. Snyder, Secretary Pompeo said North Korea's test freezing is very much focused on intercontinental type, those that pose a threat to the United States. Like comments like this, does this send jitters to South Korea and Japan?
Yeah, this is where I think the U.S. really needs to follow a make the alliances great again policy rather than a make America great again policy, precisely because our ability to defend against a threat such as North Korea relies on alliance unity, and it means that we have to depend on and work with alliance partners in order to be able to effectively respond to that kind of threat.
Mm-hmm. And there was a defense trilateral talks just in time, right after the missile launches. How did this help tackle the latest issue?
These meetings are very important. I participated in several of them during the Obama administration. They're important in ensuring that the United States, Japan, and South Korea remain on the same page when it comes to confronting a shared threat from North Korea. Mm-hmm. So they're very important, both in terms of ensuring that our military forces, or in terms of Japan, the self-defense force, are on the same page, but also in terms of making sure that politically that we're communicating and keeping those lines of communication open. It's also an important symbol, both to North Korea and to other countries interested in these issues like China, that the United States and its allies represent a united front, that they're not going to be able to drive wedges between us in order to weaken our shared resolve against the shared threat.
Mm-hmm. Now, U.S. senators and congressmen are expressing great frustration and concern over North Korea's latest missile launches. So how would this reaction from the Congress weigh on in future diplomacy, Trump administration's diplomacy with North Korea?
Well, I think the Congress has wanted to try to give the Trump administration more backbone in terms of responses to North Korea, and we see this particularly in the area of sanctions legislation. And so there could be more on the way in terms of sanctions legislation, but I'm also watching to see whether or not Congress tries to put down a marker with regards to the exercise regime in South Korea and the possibility of returning to a named exercise rotation like what we had previously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could I add on to that? I think that in addition to trying to help the administration with sanctions, there's also, as Scott mentioned, there's efforts to try to put some bounds on the negotiation. That there's some concern in Congress that in negotiations with North Korea, that President Trump will continue to give away too much in the views of the Congress. So they've already put in limits about how far down the U.S. can draw down its forces in Korea. And I expect that if there's continued to be negotiations between the United States and North Korea, that the Congress will continue to try to bound those negotiations so that, in their view, the president is not able to give away too much.
Mm-hmm. Now, North Korea didn't pay any price for its provocations this time. Would this make North Korea engage in more provocations in the near future?
I would expect to see more provocations from North Korea. Secretary of State Pompeo said in an interview just after the first provocation of this round that they're really focused on nuclear weapons testing and intercontinental ballistic missile testing, which could be read by some people in North Korea as a bit of a green light that North Korea could conduct other provocations short of that very high threshold and be met with a fairly restrained American response. So I expect to see North Korea continuing to try to test the boundaries of how much leeway they can get, both in order to demonstrate resolve, but also to try to cajole the United States into returning to credible negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And how much more would the United States tolerate North Korea's bad behavior?
I don't think that we know the line, but I think that the concern is that President Trump prizes unpredictability. And so I would say that it would be best for the North Koreans not to test President Trump, because none of us knows exactly how he's going to respond with each particular provocation.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think will be the breaking point for diplomacy?
I think it's difficult to say. President Trump has already declared success publicly after his meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, and he's also in the opening stages of a re-election campaign. So it will be difficult for him, in my estimation, to admit the failure of his diplomatic process. So my expectation is that he will try to keep things quiet, try to keep things on the diplomatic track, unless Kim Jong-un crosses some sort of threshold with a provocation, with a test, that forces Trump to respond, and I think respond in a fairly significant way. And where that line is, I think, is difficult, if not impossible, to know.
Mm-hmm. So we don't see any working level talks or any substantial negotiations on the way right now, and North Korea is engaged in provocations. So what should be U.S. strategy going forward?
I think we need to continue to keep the door open to talks, but I think that we also need to find a way to send a message to North Korea that they have reached the ceiling of what we will tolerate on provocations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's only when we've reached that point that we're likely to see a return to the negotiating table.
I just want to ask one additional question. So how can South Korea and Japan guard against North Korea's missile threat together?
Yeah. Well, there's been progress made over recent years to enhance the defense relationship between South Korea and Japan. The JSOMIA agreement being the most obvious example of that. And in my estimation, they need to continue down that road to enhance information sharing, to enhance cooperation between the ROK military and the Japanese Self-Defense Force. And I think there's a very important role for the United States there to encourage this and to enable it, enable this cooperation.
We'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
All right, thanks.
Around 40% of the population are considered to be food insecure and in need of urgent food assistance.
Our focus is on the denuclearization. If South Korea moves forward on that front, we're not going to intervene.
South Korea earlier announced it is planning to send food aid to North Korea. But after a series of North Korean missile tests, President Moon says he needs to win public support and would like to discuss with political leaders. Now, Mr. Snyder, is South Korea facing a dilemma and in an awkward situation right now?
I think that President Moon is clearly concerned about maintaining public support for food assistance. But I also think that how South Korea gives food assistance is going to be critical in terms of how we should look at it. If South Korea gives to the World Food Program, it goes through UN channels, that aid is going to be channeled to vulnerable populations, including nursing mothers and children 0 to 5. And so that addresses developmental needs long-term in North Korea. But if South Korea tries to use this as part of developing the inter-Korean relationship in order, for instance, to give bilateral rice aid to North Korea, I think really the only justification for that would be if they sell it on the open market. North Korea should be forced to buy that kind of assistance because we know that rice is what is eaten by the elites, and that on the open market, the price is too high for the vulnerable populations to be able to afford.
Now, North Korea tested missile the day after South Korea said it's planning to give food aid to North Korea. So does this mean North Korea doesn't need food aid?
No, I think it means that they believe they can conduct missile tests and that the food aid will still come. And that I think they calculated that the humanitarian aid that's needed will be somewhat separated from the broader negotiation and tension between North Korea and South Korea. And apparently that seems like a pretty good calculation on their part.
So this plan of still continuing to give food aid to North Korea comes at a time when North Korea is escalating tensions. So could we expect some backlash from the South Korean public?
I think that that's what President Moon is concerned about, is the possibility of backlash. And I do think that that is real. I think that they should look carefully at what can be supported by the public. But I also believe that the humanitarian aid situation should be separated from politics to the extent possible, because humanitarian aid is designed to reach vulnerable populations. The critical challenge with North Korea is that we don't yet have a way of determining greatest need in North Korea because we don't have the access necessary to be able to do that.
Now, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said that the United States will not intervene in South Korea's plans to give food aid to North Korea. So at this time, when North Korea is, again, escalating tensions, why is the United States not objecting to South Korea's plans?
I think there's two pieces to it. First, I think they want to be supportive of President Moon, that they see that there's value in President Moon's strategy. They want to be supportive. They at least don't want to be seen as interfering in an ally's strategy. The other piece to it, I also think there's a humanitarian piece to it. They see the North Korean people in need. This has been, at times, a recurring theme in some of the president's comments about North Korea, especially in his first year in office. So I think there's also the sense that there's clearly a humanitarian need and that the White House would not want to get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. And the size that North Korea wants food aid from the international community, is it justified considering its harvest last year?
So the UN assessment is that North Korea is in need of 1.4 million tons of assistance on top of the 5 million tons that North Korea has produced from last year. But in previous years, actually the North Koreans had begun to buy some assistance on the open market in order to make up the gap that they needed. And the highest level that they had produced was 6 million tons. And so I think that if we're talking about providing assistance that removes the incentive for North Koreans to go out and purchase food on the open market, then we're actually beginning to subsidize the regime, and I think that would be a wrong way to go.
And in UN's Universal Periodic Review, 94 countries urged North Korea to close down the concentration camps and stop torturing and violence against women. So at a time when Chairman Kim is engaged in diplomacy and a flurry of summitry, what does the latest UPR remind us?
It reminds us of who we're negotiating with. That Kim Jong-un is a leader who, even if he's committed genuinely to economic development, to reform, that he's still a person who imprisons significant percentages of his own people, who has members of his own family, political opposition murdered. He's not a man of peace. He's not a person that we can trust implicitly. That this is a negotiation with a person who's very tough, who's willing to break all the rules in order to get what he wants. And he's not somebody that you can meet a couple times and have a good, friendly relationship with and be able to use that as a basis for negotiations. Mm-hmm.
Well, the magnitude of the human rights challenge in North Korea is just so huge. And what we're really talking about when we begin to talk about promoting human rights in North Korea is challenges to the structure of the regime, which relies on political loyalty. And so in some sense, we're asking for Kim Jong-un to do things that he may perceive as risky. Very difficult to do, and I think that it just demonstrates exactly how the extent to which North Korea is an outlier in the area of human rights, and really an outlier in terms of governance globally.
Mm-hmm. We'll end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of recently renovated Daesung department store in Pyongyang. We can see several high-end international brands available for sale at the store. UN Security Council Resolution 2270 bans imports of luxury goods to North Korea. Scott?
Well, it's hard to imagine humanitarian aid to a country that has a department store like this one. And I think that it is actually a reminder of the extent to which there is a huge disparity in income. It's an income inequality in North Korea. And so this is obviously a store for elites.
Right?
I think this is a great picture to show, following a conversation about the humanitarian and food problems in North Korea, that they have a food shortage, the UN believes, of over 1 million tons this year, not because of bad weather or because of a poor harvest. It's totally because of the misallocation of North Korea's resources. That Kim Jong-un lives in tremendous luxury. He spends his country's resources on ballistic missiles, on nuclear weapons, while the vast majority of his people live in poverty. He lives in wealth. The elites are able to live apparently in an upscale airport shopping area, all the while his people are having significant food problems. So while we talk about humanitarian aid to North Korea, which I do think we should support, we should have pictures like this up during the conversation. Because the only reason they're having this problem, the reason they need this aid, is because of the decisions of Kim Jong-un and the elites in North Korea.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Denmark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Chao. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.